Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany. Good morning, everybody. Almost good afternoon. I hope you are in summer mode or almost in summer mode wherever you are. I think even for therapists this time of year, things tend to slow down a little bit and tend to be a really good reset as we get ready to move into fall and summer and all of that good stuff. So I'm hoping wherever you are today, it's feeling like we're starting that reset rhythm. And it is such an honor and a privilege to get to be with you all this morning. This is a presentation that we've done internally for our team of about 40 to 50 clinicians, but something that we're just now getting the opportunity to share more externally and more broadly. It's a model that I have gotten to do some research on and come up with. And so this acronym PRIDE actually stands for something, and we'll get to that a little bit later in our presentation. But today we're going to be talking about what it looks like to feel pride in your work, specifically thinking about what that looks like for LGBTQ plus students, LGBTQ plus staff, and making sure that whatever role you hold, that you're feeling really confident, you feel like you have the tools in your toolbox today, leaving this presentation to carry on the good work. So I'm a master's level therapist. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. I've been in the field for about 6-7 years now. And so a lot of my work tends to focus on working with LGBTQ plus kids, teens, college students, adults, pretty much everybody across the lifespan. So that's been since I entered the field for the most part, and has really become kind of a niche in the population that I serve. So right now, at the time of making this presentation, about 22% of my clients are trans or non-binary, and then around 20% of the clients I see right now identify as queer or sort of under that umbrella term. So it's folks that I get to hang out with every single day. And as a queer counselor, it also is something that is really personally important to me as well as getting to jump in with clients. And one of the really neat things about getting to do work that you love personally and professionally is also getting to be involved in community collaboration. So one thing Urban Wellness has really been trying to do is not just take the information we know as counselors and keep it sort of siloed in our 4 clinics across Chicagoland, but also make sure that we're plugging in not only to the city of Chicago and the western suburbs where we have an office, but also beyond and in the state and in the classrooms with professionals that are really sort of in the other dozens and hundreds of hours of these students' lives. We see a really small group of LGBTQ plus students in our offices, and the hour a week or hour every month we get with them is always really special and valuable. But you all are the ones that are really in the day in, day out. I sometimes, in working with college students, they'll ask me like, well, how do we work on coping skills, or how do we work on accommodations at school? And so often it's our team sending students back to you all, because you're really the ones who have some of the really good answers that actually make a difference in the lives of these students. So I know I skipped ahead to introduction, but I'm going to take us back for a second to our roadmap, just so everybody has sort of a framing for what to expect for today. So we already started to get our toes wet with introduction. We'll continue that, and then we're going to do sort of a check-in for those that feel comfortable to check in. It's a way that as therapists, we will open session, particularly with the population you all are working with. It can be really important to kind of just get a gauge and see where our sort of emotional temperature is before we get started. And for you all, that's also really important for me to know. Some of you might be showing up not having a lot of space to think about this today, and other folks might be feeling energized and ready to plug in. So I want us to sort of know where everybody is as we feel safe to share. We then are going to do a quick historical recap. I know a lot of folks are probably already pretty familiar with some of this, but just in case you're not, or maybe it's been a while since you've sort of gone through the lay of the land of what it might be like to be an LGBTQ plus student now versus 50 years ago. We're going to talk through that really quick. We also are going to talk about some terms. I think one point of feedback we get intergenerationally in our clinic is that, language evolves, right? And so I think particularly in working with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, there are sometimes terms, even as therapists, that we're not always familiar with. And so we're going to check in on that and make sure everybody is up to date, or as up to date as we can be, with some of the language. Then we're going to talk about what this model pride is. We're going to talk through 5 really concrete tools that you can use in your work, whether you're admin, whether you're teaching, whether you're in counseling, whatever it is you're doing in your day-to-day, hopefully feels adaptive. And then, as Brittany said, we'll have a time for sort of more cumulative questions. I know sometimes for me, when I'm in a presentation, I have things that pop up like slide by slide. So it can be really hard to wait. But we'll also have a broader space. We're going to leave at least 10 minutes, so around 12:20, give you all space for sort of a broader discussion if that feels helpful as well. So I am curious if you feel comfortable putting in the chat or going off mute if you want to introduce yourself. So just your name. I know I can see everybody's name, but sometimes that helps virtual training spaces feel a little more personal. And then also your pronouns right off the bat. I know I noticed at least 1 or 2 people had their pronouns with their name. And that can be a really great way if you're having a Zoom meeting or a Google Meet with a student or with a team. That can be a great way to signal, hey, I'm safe, I'm aware of this, or just dropping in the chat too, right? My name's Julia, I use she, her pronouns. And you all know my role, I'm a counselor, but curious where everybody else is. Okay, thanks, Jessica. Awesome. Thanks, Lacey. Okay. So we've got Jessica, Dean of Students. Lacey is working with 17 to 24-year-olds. Woof, that's a range, Lacey. And GED students, temporary work and placements. Awesome. Stephanie, hey, Stephanie, Director of Counseling. Meg, Manager of Transition, ESL. Oh my goodness, you all are busy. Doreen, Sociology. Oh, Sociology of Sex and Gender. What a cool class, Doreen. I want to take your class. Crystal, Dean of Student Success. Hey, Crystal. Dishwana, pronouns. Academic coach. Oh, my goodness. You all, I think, run the gamut today for all of the things. I think between this chat, we have folks in every role on campus. Hey, Patricia and Terry. Awesome. So feel free to keep dropping who you are in the chat. I think it's fun for all of us to know who all is gathered. And again, can be a great community building space without a lot of effort. If you're holding online class, I'm sure you know, or online forums, sometimes even just that extra step. I think especially working with, hey, Cindy, working with queer and trans students who may be wanting some more community on campus. It can be a really simple tweak, right? But just like throwing in your name or throwing in your pronouns, I think being able to kind of open up the space for making sure we know who everybody is. Awesome. Well, thanks to all of you for being here. And I wish we had more time today because I would love to just go in a circle, a virtual circle, and hear from each of you. It sounds like we have a lot of wisdom. So please feel free to also share if you have a niche, which it sounds like every single one of you does. Feel free to bring your niche into the chat or jump off of mute and add your expertise. There's no pressure for you to co-do this presentation today. But as we go, I hope we can learn from each other. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dive in for today. So as I mentioned, it sometimes can be helpful to do a little bit of a check-in. This is something we do as therapists. This is something I've started incorporating in our trainings. And this is something that can be really awesome with students, right? So if you want to share how you're feeling, feel free to jump off of mute or feel free to jump on the chat and let us know. This is one that I pulled that I liked because it speaks to energy, which I think can be really important in the summer. So thinking about high energy to low energy is sort of a spectrum. And then thinking about positive to negative. And then we've got just like the feel wheel, if any of you are familiar with that really awesome tool, we've got some color coding here going on, right? So if you're feeling high energy positive, you might be up here in this yellowy orangey quadrant, or maybe you're feeling kind of low today and you might be in this purpley blue quadrant. So I think I'm kind of right here in the middle. I think I've got some reddish orange colors, some orange yellow. I've got some greens, but I've also got some blues. So this resource is in the end of the presentation. There's a list of resources. It should be under mood in the resource citations. And so if you want to pull it and use it for your classroom or use it for your meeting, feel free. Okay, and I don't think I see anyone on the chat on this one, which is totally fine. So maybe even just take a minute as we continue and kind of check in with yourself. And as we go, you know, your mood may shift and change from low to high, or hopefully not high to low. So feel free to get up and move if you notice that happening. Oh, we got some chats now. Okay, awesome. Awesome. I see a blessed, I see a calm, I see an at ease. Oh, I love it. We're checking in this morning. Okay, thanks everybody. Cool. So hopefully this tool, no matter what your role is on campus, you don't have to be a therapist. Joyful, I love it. To use this hopefully feels pretty self-explanatory to students and to you, and can be pleasant but tired. Love it. Yes, Meg, I'm there with you. Can be a really helpful way to say, hey, I care about not only the fact that you're here, but also how you're here. And it can, without even needing to problem solve or use any of the tools that we'll talk about later in the presentation, is a great way to express, I'm a safe person. I get tired too, right? So often college students, I think, see us as the grown adults as never in these lower energy quadrants. And it can be really helpful to model for all students, right? That we also get tired. We also want to break in the summer. And so keep that in mind wherever you are today too. Okay, so a super brief history here. So this is a screenshot that I thought might be interesting. I know we've got a couple counseling folks here today, but if you are not familiar with counseling, the way that we use diagnoses in counseling is something called the DSM. And if you've heard of the DSM, you know that it's our diagnostic statistical manual, right? It's a fancy way of saying all the different diagnoses that college students might have, that all of us might have, are in this book. And I pulled an old screenshot of the DSM from one of the earliest versions of the DSM, just to give you all a sense of sort of grounding in queer history today, of how far we've come from using a lot of negative, stigmatizing, pathologizing language. And we still have a long way to go, right? But I sometimes will talk, if I'm talking with parents or grandparents or other caregivers of students, I sometimes will talk about this just as some psychoeducation, right? Which is a fancy way of saying, like, bringing some of that history and that knowledge into the room. And not to give anybody a free pass or to excuse anything, right? But more to help us understand that we have come a long way in the last 50 years, right? And even as a mental health field, we've come a long way in the last 50 years with some of this language. The DSM did not change some of this stigmatizing language around queer folks until the 70s. Right? So if you are someone who has been in your field for a while, this may be something that maybe even when you were training and coming up and learning models in higher ed, this might have permeated your field, right? And that's on us as therapists. We have a lot of work to do in apologizing and a lot of the harm that we've caused the queer community. But I think it also allows us to have some compassion for where students might be coming in with internalized homophobia or internalized transphobia. And also where families might also be needing some education and some updating of these terms, right? So I think holding that intention can be really important in the therapy room in working with young adults and college students, right? But also whether you're a counselor or whether you are teaching a class or whether you're a dean, sort of living in that tension of the both and, right? That we now have so many better tools and much better language and ways of thinking and understanding the queer community and the queer experience. And there's a long and painful history in psychology, in the ways that, psychology influenced education, the ways that was upheld in various institutions of higher ed as far as policing or discipline or punishment and all of those sorts of things. So I think it can be helpful for us to sort of think back a little bit and frame ourselves in that space. If we're thinking about, even students thinking about, am I safe on campus, right? I think for a lot of us who maybe have, been around longer than some students, it can feel like, oh my goodness, of course you're safe, right? But I think for a student who maybe this is their parents' snapshot of knowledge of what it means to be queer or trans, or their grandparents' knowledge of what it means to be queer or trans, for then their student to be joining, things I talk about in session, like joining a pride club on campus or joining a community space on campus for trans people. I think, a lot of this is really important to make sure that we are also educating folks as we go. So that is something I feel like we could spend a lot of time on. But just, I think, always humbling for me to remember as a therapist that I'm still learning, I'm still growing. I think even as a queer person, there are things that my clients are still teaching me. And I think it's also important to remember that we can all still learn and grow, right? Okay. So I'll pause here after this next slide, but I want to make sure we get through some terms. So the first pride flag, and you all hopefully can see these two flags over here on the side of your screen. But the first pride flag was created in 1978. And we then have these more modern pride flags. So if you remember, and some of you may still have on campus, just the rainbow part of this flag. The most updated flag is here at the bottom to include the intersex community, which is awesome. And I think looks so pretty with all of the beautiful colors. And then the second most updated version, which also may be on some of your campuses or in some of your classrooms, is up here. So these flags were made to include the trans community, the BIPOC community, and the intersex community. So the most updated version we have is this 2021 flag, which hopefully you're able to find online. I think one thing our office has done recently is make sure that we have a pride flag not only in the waiting room where clients come before session to gather and wait, but also make sure that each individual clinician, if they want one, can display a sticker, can display a flag. And so that's something to think about too. As a college student, now a while ago, all my college students now tease me about being a millennial, but I think, that was something that really would have stood out to me if I had seen a pride flag or a pin on a professor or a dean. And not that, everybody needs to go out and buy all the things, but thinking about what can I do with the space I have? What can I do with how I'm maybe physically showing up to different rooms on campus? One thing, I think it depends on where you're at, but if you have a lanyard, is there something small that you could stick on your lanyard? Even just things that students see can be super duper important. So thinking about terms for the LGBTQ plus community, we're going to break it down just to make sure everybody feels like we've got a really good understanding. So L stands for lesbian. So to women typically is how we refer with that term. And then gay typically is used for men that are attracted to people of the same sex. Bisexual, you're attracted to both men and women. Trans, that your identity does not match your sex assigned at birth. And a heads up here too, you all may be seeing this as well, but think one of the things that's been really cool about at least the last like 3-4 years of students in particular is that we're using trans as really an expansive term and almost an umbrella term to include folks that are genderqueer or non-binary. So that's something I will check in on with students too as a therapist. If they're using the label of trans, making sure I'm understanding sort of where they're falling under that umbrella or if that term feels best to them. Queer, also sometimes used as questioning. Again, this can also be a super expansive term. When I introduced myself as a queer therapist. And so I think people use that term in regards to sexuality. People also use that term in regards to gender. So again, it can be really helpful if you have a safe relationship with the student to make sure that you're understanding best how to support them within that term. Intersex. So again, this could be a whole presentation here because I feel like this is one of the least talked about pieces, and even in our flags here, right? The intersex community did a lot of really amazing advocacy work to have their flag included in the Pride flag. But folks that may have been born with both sort of stereotypically male and female sex assigned at birth characteristics. And then asexual, aromantic, agender. So the A, again, is also becoming a more expansive term. I think folks are most familiar with A as asexual, but also pay attention to the agender and aromantic as well, because some students will be using A in that sense. And then 2S is a Native and Indigenous specific term, which really honors folks that identify as two-spirit that are Native and Indigenous. And so it's something in Indigenous culture that is really revered, which is amazing and beautiful. If you have an opportunity to talk to a two-spirit student, it really is a cool identity to get to learn about. And then plus is, again, sort of an umbrella term for other identities. So typically when folks are talking about the LGBTQ plus community, we'll say just that. I know for some of your websites and resources, it also might say LGBTQIA2S plus, which is sort of the most inclusive language and most inclusive umbrella over the umbrella term that you can use. But I think the most important thing here is that we are making sure that we include everyone at the table, right? And so whether it's your classroom or your counseling center, whether it's a flag or a statement on your website, that students know at the end of the day, no matter who I am, no matter how I identify on the outside, or no matter what I'm discerning on the inside, I know this is a safe and welcoming space for me. And I can say as a queer person, I am so much more willing to have a conversation about language or all sorts of topics if I know the person is safe, versus I think sometimes we can feel anxiety about messing up or getting the language wrong, when I think at the end of the day, and again, I don't speak for the whole queer community, but for my particular slice, it's so much more important to me to know that the relationship is safe, and we can have any number of conversations, right, out of that framework. Versus if the relationship feels unsafe, a question about, well, what does this mean? Or what does that mean? Can sometimes feel unsafe, right? Or like a threat to the relationship. So I think that's a really important reminder too, not only in this space, but also beyond this space, making sure that you have space to ask questions. And my email is in the end of this presentation. If you have questions as we go that maybe you feel awkward to ask, even without knowing all of you, just knowing the work you do, I think gives safety in the relationship, right? I trust that your best interest is in the interest of students, and hopefully you trust that of me as well. And so I invite any and all questions. There are no dumb questions if you want to connect via email. But as promised, I'm going to pause us there before we keep going, because I know it's kind of like drinking through a fire hose. If anyone wants to add anything in the chat from your experience, or maybe there's a student that you're thinking of as we're moving through this, and some wisdom or perspective that might be helpful for us to hear from you. So I'll give us just a second, no pressure, and then we'll keep rolling if we don't have any thoughts. Okay. Feel free as we keep rolling. If thoughts do emerge, bring us back. Doreen is reflecting, I love this idea of safety in the relationship. Thank you, Doreen. Because we define what's happening in our interaction. Yeah. Yeah, I think, that's something I'm sure we could probably spend another hour on, right? And I think you all could probably teach us as therapists a lot about what student safety is feeling like these days on campus. And, I think it's something that, again, I think it's, we sometimes in the therapy room call it the dialectic, right? This idea of two truths at once. I both can be harmed by your words and know that you've got my back and you've got my best interest at heart. And that's where I think so much of our work as therapists is also encouraging our clients to communicate, right? To advocate for themselves, to, if they don't see a pride flag or an indicator on campus or at a resource center that it's a safe space, talk about it, right? And so often I think many of you, I'm sure, and many of the places you're at want students to feel that and know that, but it's sometimes, I think as humans, we can miss each other, right? And what's the difference between knowing that I care about student safety and making sure a student feels safe, right? I think it's the same as therapists. We know that we would do anything for our clients, but what are the concrete ways when we boil it down that clients are actually feeling and experiencing that when they're with us? Okay. So I was thinking about FAQs for you all today. And one of the things that I get asked a lot in all sorts of different ways is, why are there so many LGBTQ plus people, right? Why are there so many LGBTQ plus kids? Why are there so many LGBTQ plus folks going to college, right? Whatever the question is, this is something that I hear a lot. So you might not have had this thought, but maybe a coworker, maybe a colleague, maybe a parent you're going to bump into, maybe even a student that you work with might have this question, right? And I think it's an interesting one because when we look at the data now, 7.2% of US adults, so I know someone said they're right at that like 17 to 24 cusp. So I did include some like older adolescent information because I know some of you all might have a chunk of your day that is under that 18 mark. But thinking about 18 and up, US adults, we've got about 7.2% identifying as LGBTQ plus, right? So this is an interesting one, and feel free to take a screenshot, share it when the link comes out with folks that could use it. But Gen Z is here in red. So that's 97 to 04. Millennials are here in yellow if you've got folks in that demographic, and then Gen X, baby boomers, and traditionalists. So you may have some students under that umbrella as well. But I want us to pay attention here for a second to the Gen Z and millennial trend. And this is Gallup data here. And I don't mean trend like it's trendy, but I mean, what do you all notice? And feel free to jump in the chat if you're feeling like you've got some insight, or go off mute, or maybe just jot it down. What do you notice from 2014 to 2022 here? This 8-year span of data with Gen Z coming on the scene and millennials aging. Does anybody notice anything? And while I'm encouraging you to think about that for a second, I looked right before this to make sure I had the latest data, because as we know, research takes a very long time. Shout out to whoever said they were teaching a sociology of sex and gender class, right? Research typically takes about 5 years to get on the scene where we see it. So the latest research right now from 2020, which was a sample of 180,000 college-age students, was that around 17% of them identify as LGBTQ+. So about 17% of college students in particular, that age. And what I notice about this is when Gen Z came on the scene in 2020, we see it helps everybody, right? With the exception of, I know some of the baby boomers are about the same, and the traditionalists are about the same. But you see Gen X go up a little bit. You see millennials increase rates of disclosure, and you see Gen Z. Okay, let's see, Lacey. Gen Z appears to feel free to share publicly. Yes, yes. And I think that's one really important thing, right? Not to give us the answer key before we're done, but that is what I end up saying to families so often, right? It's not that there are more queer people. It's not that there are more trans people. It's that we finally have generations of folks that feel safe to be themselves publicly, right? And I think that can be a really, really important distinction, right? Because it's not that somehow Gen Z is just having higher birth rates of queer folks in their generation, right? It's that if you think back to wherever you fall on this generation map, folks were not able to show up to campus and share who they were, right? Folks did not have support groups in the Student Resource Center that made it okay to be who they were, right? There weren't booths. We recently were at an education summit last year, and there were so many booths, right? All these big hospitals in Illinois, all of these amazing clinics in Illinois with amazing rainbow stuff and pride stuff and stress balls and fidgets and right. And that just has not always been there for LGBTQ plus folks. And so I think that can be important to remember too in our work that yes, we are seeing higher rates of folks who feel safe to come out, and making sure that we are understanding why that is can be really, really important. And I don't know about you all, but having known Gen Alpha just a little bit, my sense is day one rolling up to campus, they are going to continue some of the hard work of Gen Z and continue with some of this trending we're seeing in the research. My guess is 5 years from now, when we have research on 2025, we're going to see this continue to shift and trend. So it's really awesome that you all are here today, because I think not only is it important to talk about just as people, but it also is really important to think about the trends of your career, right? And making sure that we have the tools in our toolbox before students hit campus, because this is only going to be something that becomes more and more and more important. Okay. So we now are going to move into this model, okay? So this is something I got to present at the Association of Play Therapy, which is folks a little bit younger than I think any of the demographics you work with. But this was out in Southern California, and it was really awesome just to get to sort of pilot this model, talk about this model, what it might look like. And again, as I mentioned, this is something that I presented to our team internally as far as some concrete and tangible modeling we might be using as therapists. It's something I use, I don't want to say every single day, but a lot of days in my work. And it's something that I hope you all feel like is a really easy acronym to remember and to take with you. So PRIDE stands for pause, reflect, inquire using intersectionality, disclose when appropriate, and we'll get to that. And then the E is explore further. If you are someone who's teaching a class right now, feel free to take this and use it. It is yours to do with what you want to do with it. One thing that I think I have been noticing in doing a lot of research on this topic recently is that there are not a lot of working models out there that are rooted in psychology that help us in the day-to-day process of learning and growth, right? So I think we have a lot of awesome research happening right now in our field, but I don't know, I could be wrong about this. I don't know that it feels to folks who have the boots on the ground in education like we are always doing a good job helping sort of pass the baton from what we're learning in our field into your space. And so this is something that I hope feels really concretely helpful, and something that I think so far, at least in the therapeutic space, has been really helpful. Okay, so P stands for pause. So the first thing before you do anything with an LGBTQ plus student or friend or family member or fellow staff person is I want you to pause. And this is good wisdom, I think, even in just life, right? Not even with a model, not even with LGBTQ plus care, but just in life, right? Before we respond, we're going to pause. And I want you to think first, where am I noticing this in my body, right? So before we have the perfect answer or jump to the research, what do you feel? Are your hands tight? Is your stomach in knots? Are you getting sweaty, right? I think so often we are taught, especially as helpers and folks who put our students first, right? We are taught to notice them and their response before we check in on our response. But it's like the oxygen mask on the plane, right? We need to put on our oxygen mask first, so our brain and body is still working so we can help the student. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing I want you to think about is, where are our biases showing up, right? Before we move into the next steps of this model, what might I have not experienced before? What feels new or different to me, right? What am I not trained in? I want us to notice that, because I think sometimes it's easy to notice it and then immediately get anxious or start blaming ourselves. And all of you are in this training today, which is awesome. But maybe for a colleague or a coworker, they're not here and they might say, oh my gosh, I should have gone to that training. I have no idea what to do, right? And you can remind them, hey, we've all got biases. We're all not trained perfectly on all the things. Notice that. And then moving on to the step of, what information might I need or be missing? Okay, so you're going to notice your body, you're going to notice your biases, and then you're going to think about, what info do I not have, right? So thinking about a student coming to you and saying, hey, I am really struggling right now, right? I think I might be somewhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. That's missing information, right? As a therapist, I immediately want to know, where are we struggling? Are we talking about grades? Are we talking about substance? Are we talking about an internal struggle that maybe nobody on campus will ever be able to see, right? What are we missing with this? And then finally, what factors do I need to consider when working with those who might not be in the room right now, who are involved in the life of the student or this person, right? Now, you all can speak to this way better than I can, but I will say, even as a one-to-one therapist, you're working with the family, you're working with the school, you're working with whoever is paying for school, right? Whether it's the student or the employer or whoever it is, right? The family. And so making sure that we also are attuned to, it's the person in front of me, but there also are all these other systems, right, that I need to be thinking about, especially when I'm thinking about safety for the student and for myself, right? And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. I want to make sure we've got a second if anyone has a question on part 1 of 5 of this before we zoom on. So feel free to drop it in the chat. I am going to go ahead and move on to the R if we don't. And again, these slides are available. I know this is a lot of content. As Brittany said, it'll be recorded as well, but feel free as we go, if you want to jot down the acronym or some of the questions that stand out to you, take what you need. Okay. So the next step is to reflect. Okay, so after we're done pausing, we're going to reflect. Where is the student coming from? Where's my client coming from? Both physically and emotionally. Okay, so something I threw in here was, has the student moved regions within the US recently? That's something we're going to talk about in just a second. But thinking about, where was this student before Illinois, right? That might shape the experience, just the physical journey of the student, right? But also the emotional journey. If we are coming from a small rural town in heading to our local community college, that might be a different student story and a different student experience than a kid who's lived in downtown Chicago their whole life and lived in Lincoln Park and is connecting with you out in Elgin for some resources, right? It's not right or wrong, good or bad, but understanding the location physically and emotionally of the student. Also thinking about the student's socioeconomic status, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But one of the things that is really interesting about the research of LGBTQ plus students is the stark differences when we start to break down things like LGBTQ plus race and culture and the intersectionality with, in particular, BIPOC trans students, and things that are really, really, really hard, right? Things like, am I able to keep a job if I come out at work? Am I able to continue to pay for school if I come out at home, right? And thinking about that as a piece of this too. That's something for therapy that I think, folks don't often think about when they think about folks seeking resources. But that's a piece that, even for our under, like our 18 to 24-year-olds who are still on parent insurance, even thinking about things like referrals for hormone therapy or things, like additional resources for support groups. It's something I have to be conscious of as a counselor to make sure that, if family is still helping us out financially or we're on family insurance, that student knows that and is aware of that. And we are choosing resources that are supportive of wherever they are financially. Also thinking about the intersectionality of all of these pieces, right? Not only with socioeconomic status, but thinking about what is the race of the student? What is the cultural background of the student, right? Thinking about pronouns, right? Again, reflection. Thinking about, is the student using, she, her pronouns with me, but he, him pronouns everywhere else? That's something I need to make sure I remember, right? If I'm corresponding with other folks who the student is not out to. That's a really big one. I think I see come up a good amount, right? All it takes is 10 or 20 seconds to jot that down in a note if you're consulting or sharing on a student. But it's something that, can be really easy to forget and I think can be really hard on a student who may have to kind of pick and choose where we're able to be out. And then finally, thinking about, is the student out, right? Maybe you were the one safe person the student could stop after class, and maybe they haven't told even friends, right? And so how are we reflecting on things like emotional safety and community support with the student in front of us? Oh, thanks for jumping in. I see a chat from Doreen. So if you want to head to the chat, everybody, Doreen is sharing a personal story, which is really important. Oh, yes. Thank you, Doreen, for sharing this. Super important. I'll summarize really quick as you all head over to the chat. So Doreen's sharing about their daughter and just the importance of the use of pronouns. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So as we go, feel free to jump in on that piece, but I want to make sure in this space of reflection, before we move on to the I part of our model, we're thinking about, again, some of this SES intersection, and also thinking about things. I know a couple of you said, hey, I'm working at, and I'm working in a role where I'm getting folks connected with jobs, right? What important work. And thinking about some of the risk factors and barriers for LGBTQ plus students that other folks may not be facing. So this is something you can come back to, and please come back to it because the data is just fascinating. But looking at overall, LGBTQ plus people are about 17% more likely to be at or under the poverty line. And you can look through here one by one. Being trans is an enormous SES risk factor. And then within that, for BIPOC, trans, and LGBTQ plus folks, the risk factors only increase as far as things like socioeconomic insecurity. So feel free to take a look at that later. There also is really awesome research online, free and publicly available. If you just Google, job resourcing and LGBTQ plus folks, or housing and LGBTQ plus folks, there's tons and tons of hits and really important research being done right now. It's something I think that, even in working with folks who may have insurance and access to outpatient therapy, I am always amazed at, the barriers that a lot of these kids, and I know they're not kids, but a lot of these young people overcome, right? Just to sort of get themselves to class, get themselves to their part-time job, get themselves home, right? They might be caregiving for other folks. I think we all know that queer folks and trans folks are more likely to be kicked out of the home, right? In high school. So they may be at your community college, and their dream might have been to have started in trade school or jumped into a four-year college, and they may be experiencing, a housing crisis, or they may be experiencing having a crash with a friend and kind of get recalibrated. So I think it's really important to think about, again, not only sort of each of our roles, but also where these students are coming from and how they ended up in front of us, because I think not everybody has the same path, right? Especially with things like education and therapy and healthcare. Okay. So I also wanted to throw in for you all some of the religion and spirituality elements, which again, I think on each of these slides, we could all have a really amazing hour-long coffee talk and just keep the day going. But this is something that I think wherever you are across Illinois can be really important. And so looking at how important it is, particularly for Native and Indigenous students, Middle Eastern and Northern African students, when asked for these LGBTQ plus adolescents, how important is your religion and spirituality to you? 34%, 33% of Native, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, Northern African students were saying, yes, this is super important to me, right? Also looking at Black LGBTQ plus students and sort of the third highest reported group there. I think it can be really easy as a therapist or as a professor or as a director, a dean, for us to assume, right, that the student might be coming from a super religious background, but they probably don't care about it anymore, right? I think we've all had that pop into our heads at some point, maybe. But I think a lot of these students are saying, no, this does still really matter to me, right? How I was raised in all of these groups are almost at 20% and up across the board, right? That even if I'm coming from a really conservative religious background, this is still a part of my identity when I'm showing up in front of you, right? And so making sure that we hold that in our minds too. So coming to Illinois from another state, one other piece to reflect on here, thinking about where students might be coming in from, okay? So this is a map of the US with sort of a color graded spectrum here of the legislation happening in the state. So you can see the Southeast is pretty much in this negative overall policy tally. So legislation that would be harmful to students in your population and in this demographic. The orangey is low overall, still not great. This beigey, like right around us in the Midwest, is in fair, so not great, but not terrible. And then light green, you see medium, and this dark green is a high overall policy tally, so safety for students, right? So if we look at Illinois here, you all, if anyone wants to jump in the chat, you're more than welcome to, because you all may have some insight. But if you look at Illinois and all of our bordering states, we kind of run the spectrum as far as who's around us who might be coming to you for resources, right? We are the only, I'll go ahead and again give the answer key. We are the only dark green in our region though, right? We got Minnesota up here, but other than that, you all, we are kind of an island. So when you're thinking about your role as dean, your role as director of counseling, your role as the person helping get connected to temporary work placements, right? Sociology, whatever you are doing, I think it's really important to also start to think about if you are someone who's seen a lot of students from Illinois, that may start to shift and change soon, right? And I don't say that to scare anybody, but just to draw our attention to the fact that you might have more students coming from Tennessee and moving to Illinois and enrolling in your program, right? You might have a student who knows nothing about the Midwest culturally and moves up from Texas, right? And starting to think about what sorts of conversations are we having with our teams about these students that could be coming in. So 2 things I like to ask if I know that a student is coming from another state. I think one is tell me about where you came from, right? Tell me about what it was like. And today we're just focusing on sort of maybe some of the domestic changes with students coming to Illinois. Obviously, there's also international students and all of those pieces, which are so important for hopefully another presentation in the future. But thinking about even just locally, right around us, tell me about where you came from. What was it like in Indiana? Or why didn't you stay in Missouri for college or whatever it is, right? And then I think also asking if it feels safe to you and the student, tell me about why you chose Illinois, right? For a lot of LGBTQ plus students, this probably was not on accident, right? And I think we'll be seeing that more and more with students coming out of state. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. If anybody has thoughts on the map or sort of changing demographics within our state, feel free to jump in on the chat, but we're going to keep going. So the I, we've got the P, the R, now the I. Inquire intersectionally. I think at autocorrect. What areas might I not typically consider trauma that could be a trigger for the student? Okay, so one thing as counselors that we're trained to ask about is like family history. And I think that can be really important to realize, even if you're just filling out a super simple form, that family history could feel activating to a student. Right? A lot of LGBTQ plus folks are no longer in relationship in the same way with their family of origin. For us, asking about previous therapy can sometimes feel triggering. For you all, it may be asking about previous education, or it may be asking about what high school was like. That might feel activating, and you might not know that you accidentally stepped on a minefield, right? But that could be why. Maybe there was bullying, or maybe there was pain with why we had to change schools or change environments. And then also knowing how will I know when I'm feeling activated, right? As I'm moving through this model, again, continuing to check in with myself and notice, is there anything coming up for me as I'm asking these questions, right? And even if you are not someone who identifies as queer or as trans, I think it's really important even for cis folks and heterosexual folks to notice, oh, this is bringing up a memory of another student I had, or, ooh, this is really bringing up something about the way I was raised, right? And then asking questions. One I included that you may consider asking is, what are some questions you wish someone at school would have asked you about your gender or sexuality in the past, right? And I think, again, that might not be for every student, but thinking about letting the student also be the expert on their experience. And this is one that I sometimes will ask at the end of an intake session, which is like the first session that we do when we start the therapy process. What's a question I wish, or you wish that I would have asked you today? What's a question a therapist maybe hasn't asked you about your gender identity or your sexual orientation? Okay. And then with intersectionality here, you all, as we're thinking about inquiring with students, we have 2 different graphs here from the Trevor Project talking about trauma and talking about suicide risk. And so content warning here, if you need to get up and step out for a second and get a refill of tea or coffee, feel free to do so, because we're going to be talking about this really quick, and that might feel activating to some folks. But as you can see here, there's an enormous amount of LGBTQ plus youth who reported high levels of trauma, particularly Native and Indigenous LGBTQ plus youth, you all, right? Like over 50% are reporting trauma. And so when we're thinking about job skills, when we're thinking about grades, when we're thinking about how we show up in a space, right? There's going to be trauma there for a lot of LGBTQ plus folks. Again, every single breakdown by race and ethnicity is over 29%, which is a lot, right? If you have 3 students in a room, statistically, at least one of them, regardless of racial or ethnic or cultural background, is going to have experienced trauma if they're LGBTQ plus, right? And maybe thinking about what demographics of students you're working with most often, right? Again, Middle Eastern and Northern African students are sort of the second highest level of trauma here. And then biracial, multiracial, LGBTQ plus youth are sort of in that third spot. I think also then, thinking about if we have that strong trauma history as an LGBTQ plus person, what that means for suicidality, right? And again, I think this is a whole conversation that we could have as educators and mental health professionals. And hopefully you all are receiving really good training around suicidal ideation and risk and those things, because I know that is so, so, so important right now in all of your different roles. But looking here at students that seriously considered suicide in the last year, this dark purple here, you all, this 39% is trans and non-binary students. And that is a lot of students, right? Almost 40% of trans and non-binary college students considering suicide in the last year, right? That is an enormous number. If you have 10 folks, 10 college students in a room together, and 4 of them are considering taking their own life while at school, I mean, it's just heartbreaking, right? And then you've got this light purple for BIPOC students, and then this navy-ish, lighter navy color here is the sample of overall LGBTQ plus college students, right? And then we won't go into this piece today, but just for you all to know, in case you need a why this is important, why you all want more training, why we need more funding, why you need more resources for your office. This is the rates of attempted suicide in the last year for LGBTQ plus students. So you can see, again, for BIPOC LGBTQ plus students and trans and non-binary students, I mean, 9% is just, it makes you want to burst into tears, I think, as an educator and as a therapist, right? And that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm doing it. But it's just heartbreaking when you sit with those stats. So thank you to all of you for being here as we continue on. We've got about 15 more minutes of content, and then we'll pause for questions. But again, pay attention to your body. If this is feeling activating, shake it off. You're all off camera. Get up and get something to drink or a snack, and come back and join us. But I want to make sure we understand, for some folks, this is life or death, right? Having these tools and these skills. And it doesn't mean we need to be perfect. And it doesn't mean that we can't have good days and bad days with these students. But at the end of the day, we have students who think that it would be better off not to be here anymore than to be queer or to be trans. And I think it is so important that they remember, no matter what, at the end of the day, yes, grades are important. Yes, career is important, but they are important, right? And their lives matter. And that's why we all do what we do. Okay, so we're going to move into the 4th part out of all 5 parts of our Pride model. And I want us to think about disclosure. So thinking about first, is it safe for me to self-disclose, right? Am I able to share about myself? So for example, for me as a queer cis woman, I will disclose, hey, I'm a therapist, I'm gay, Awesome. That's why I'm doing this, right? For you, your identity markers might look different. And so what you're disclosing might be, hey, I'm an ally. It's important for me to know that you feel safe, right? Or, hey, you know what? I actually am married to a woman, or use these pronouns and you may not know that about me, right? Or whatever it is. And then I think thinking about, is it safe for the student to self-disclose? And this in some ways is as important or even sometimes more important, right? Depending on sort of where the safety is. I think, my sense is if you're here today, your organization, your school is supportive of you, right? And supportive of your students that are LGBTQ plus. But that's not the case for everybody, right? And that's not the case for all your students, maybe when they go home to wherever home is. And so making sure that when they're sharing with you, you and the student have a really good understanding of expectations, right? So how can I use implicit versus explicit self-disclosure in my work? So implicit self-disclosure is the things that we're not saying, but we're showing, right? So we already talked about having a flag, right? Or maybe a sticker. I have both right now, you all. It's Pride Month, and I want to make sure everybody I work with knows that they are welcome, and not just welcomed at a bare minimum, but celebrated, right? Pronoun pins. I also have a pronoun pin in my office. I don't know that I've worn it in a session because we don't really have like lanyards or anything, but it's displayed. It's like pinned into something. So that's always an option too. But thinking about, how do I communicate to a student, you are safe here, right? And more importantly, I am a safe person, right? You can tell me what you need to tell me. And we'll get to the rest later, right? Whatever we're talking about today, nothing matters more than the safety in the room. And then also thinking about explicit self-disclosure, right? So verbal disclosure. So maybe verbally disclosing gender identity or sexual orientation as you feel safe and as it feels helpful to the student, right? But basically to let the student know, I've been where you are, right? I sometimes will say to my teens, so right before they come to you all, right? I was in therapy at 15. It was hard, right? I was LGBTQ plus when I was 15. It was hard. And so whatever age or whatever you're working with, I think sometimes just an acknowledgement of, I know what it feels like on some level to be in your shoes, and making sure that students know, again, even if your status is ally, that is known, right? Maybe you were in high school trying to figure it out, or you were in college trying to figure it out, and how do students know and feel that? So feel free to jump in with questions there. We're going to continue on to this last part. And let me look. Okay, so we've got a few more. So yeah, we're going to keep zooming through, and feel free to jump in as we close up the model. And then I'm going to show you all a couple different resources just to make sure we've got some good takeaways. And then, as I mentioned, at about 12:20, we'll transition into 10 minutes of questions. So thanks everybody for hanging in. So the E is to explore further, right? So we're pausing, we're reflecting, we're inquiring intersectionally, I'm auto-correcting myself. We're disclosing, as we just covered, and we're exploring further. So where do I need support with this student professionally? And no matter what your identity is or identities are, you might need more support, and that's okay. That doesn't say anything about you or your competency, but we all need more support, right? Thinking about, do you have a supervisor you can talk to? Are there some straight and cis colleagues you can talk to, right? We want to make sure with whatever it is, we're not putting the burden on the marginalized group. And so we want to make sure we're not necessarily always going to our one favorite gay coworker, right? But maybe you have a couple trusted folks at work that are straight and cis. If you're straight and cis, that you can talk to and talk through things with, ask questions with. If you're queer, that might feel safer with some queer colleagues, or if you're non-binary or gender expansive, maybe with some non-binary gender expansive folks that you might know. And then thinking about, where might I need some support personally, right? not only professionally, but maybe this brought up emotions I didn't even know I had, right? Maybe this is my reminder to get myself into therapy. My goodness, we all need it, right? Therapists go to therapy, you all. I have benefited so much from being a therapist in therapy. And I think just being in education right now, all of you should be entitled to at least 10 free sessions, a punch card. But this might be a signal, right? As you're using this model, as you're checking in with yourself, am I needing a space? Or maybe it's needing to rely more on your community. I so appreciated some of the personal pieces you all have shared so far. And maybe it's as simple as getting some coworkers together for lunch just to feel some solidarity. And then what tools and resources do I not have yet, right? As counselors, and I'm not sure how it works for you all, but we have to take continuing ed. And so maybe it's something that, like, you know what, for 2025, for 2026, I'm going to commit to doing at least 2 more trainings, right? To make sure that I'm equipped to support students the best I can moving into the next school year. Or maybe it's, you know what, between now and the end of summer, my goal is going to be to set up my room in a way that students know that when they walk in, they have at least 3 things they can point to know that I'm a supportive space, whatever that looks like for you. So we're going to shift away from the pride model now, you all. So feel free to jump in on questions with either the exploration part or the model. But we're going to look at a couple final resources just to make sure your toolbox is full before you head out for today. So this is a resource by the Trans Student Educational Resources Network. Their info is up here and it's also in a resource slide. And so feel free to check out the website. This is a resource that's available now in a ton of different languages, which is awesome. I know one person mentioned working in some ESL. And so if this is a resource that you're able to provide to a student in their language, that's awesome. But I went ahead and pulled the English copy just for today. And it talks about this idea of all of us being unicorns, which I love so much. And it talks about breaking down gender identity and gender expression into different groups, and then physical and emotional attraction into different groups. And then if you do this resource online in the interactive format, these little dark circles here, you can drag along the spectrum. If you do it, you can print it out, or you can use just a screenshotted copy like I do. You can kind of talk through it, which also can be really helpful. So this is something, depending on sort of the role you serve. I know if you're in the counseling center, this might be a great activity to do with your client, right? If you are in more of a classroom space or more of a collaborative, resource space, this might be something that you just send the link to, you recommend a student to do, but something that can be really, really helpful and just sort of normalizing, all of us fall on these spectrums, right? And even if you are cis and your gender identity is 100% cis and your gender expression is 100% with sex assigned at birth, I think it can be really important to name those things, because I think, again, sometimes students look at us as sort of the capital A adults and assume somehow we have it all figured out and that we know exactly where we are on all the spectrums all the time, right? And I think normalizing for students that this is fluid, right? And that where you were when you were their age might have shifted and changed. And that, that can be so much more important to name and talk about than just pretending like somehow we have it all figured out just because we have certain letters behind our name, or we have certain, things that we've completed professionally. I think this can be a really uniting and really humbling resource to kind of bring us all to the same playing field. So check that out for sure. You might even have your office do it at home. You might share it with your family, but this is this Trans Student Ed Resources is a great website. So I encourage you to check it out there. In the last 5 or so minutes here, I wanted to cover some words and phrases that we are not using anymore, and some words and phrases that we are using. So this is something that we hear in the therapy room. You might hear it in orientation. You might hear it on the first day of school. You might hear it in a Zoom meeting, but it's something really easy that we can all work on shifting, right? And so I went ahead and broke it down into a table for you all. And there's even a nifty arrow. So, instead of this, we can encourage people to use this. So not so much using the word homosexual anymore, right? So I think that's sort of a dated term that for a lot of folks that you all are serving, that probably will not be the most helpful term. But maybe instead saying, what language do you prefer I use to speak about your sexual orientation? And you might not, word it that formally. Certainly with a lot of the students I work with, they would laugh at me if I worded it that clinically. But hey, like, what words feel best when I speak about you? Right? I love that some of that language has entered like the pronoun vernacular that I've heard folks say recently, like, when you speak about me, you can use she, her pronouns. I think that is such an awesome way of wording it. Sexual preference, again, this is an older term that you may hear families use of the students you serve. And I think it can be a really easy one to say, like, you know what, actually, we're going to say sexual orientation instead. And here's why, right? Sexual orientation is a better term because preference suggests that there's like a choice in it for the student, right? Versus orientation is how I was made. Anything about like the lifestyle or the gay lifestyle. My wife and I were joking the other night, we came home from a Pride event. We were in our pajamas. We're eating ice cream on the couch. We're like, this is the gay lifestyle, right? Because it's not a monolith. And I think when people say lifestyle or gay lifestyle, they're imagining a very specific sort of person doing a very specific thing instead of, like, there's no straight lifestyle, right? There's no cis lifestyle. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because humans are beautiful and amazing, and we all live life in a number of ways. So remembering, that phrase really is not our best language anymore. Referring to anything under the LGBTQ plus spectrum is a phase, right? I think something I sometimes will ask students is like, how long have you been able to live fully as yourself, right? Or as fully yourself can be a great way to word it too. I think phase suggests that, again, there's like a moment in time that this is happening versus this is who I am, right? And I think it can feel invalidating to hear that. I know that's how I've experienced it when I've heard it. And again, it can be a really easy correction. Anything that has previously been used as a slur for the community, we're not going to use, right? And when I did this presentation to our team, I said, thanks for showing up today, right? If you're thinking about using anything that's been a slur for the queer community, instead, maybe just gratitude. And like, I'm so glad you're here, right? It is just best to avoid. And then finally, anything about alphabet soup, or sometimes folks will say like, I don't even remember all the letters, or there's too many letters to count. I don't know if you all have heard things like that before. I interpret those comments as sort of like folks maybe feeling uncomfortable or not up to date with the language, like you are now, hopefully, after this presentation. And so I think sometimes it can be best to just say, hey, you know what? I know language changes quick, but right now it's actually LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA plus, right? And making sure that we're just kind of nipping that in the bud. The last thing that I included here, you all, and I actually had not included this initially because I didn't want it to feel self-promotional and icky, but I went back this morning and I added it in just in case it could help even one person. So last spring, I got to do in Normal, Illinois, which some of you all may be near, I got to do a TEDx talk on the power of LGBTQ plus allyship. So today we've been talking specifically about the Pride model. But last spring, when I presented, it was on allyship for mental health care. And I included the video just in case you are wanting a little more information. We got our toes wet with some of the statistics and graphs today. But this really outlines a little bit more of that if you're wanting a little bit more. So feel free to check it out. Feel free, if there's somebody, I know somebody mentioned, a kid, or if, maybe not even professionally, maybe you have a family member that needs some receipts for why the work you're doing in your role is important. Feel free to steal this and use it. You're always welcome to throw me under the bus with these stats and resources. So I went ahead and included it, and hopefully you all know it is in a spirit of resource sharing and not trying to have you watch something that I did last spring. But that's there if you're wanting more info beyond today. And then this will also be recorded too, which is so awesome, just in case you have questions after today, or maybe, I know we were moving pretty quickly. There were things that maybe got missed, or you needed to step away for a second. You'll have access to that as well. Oops, hold on one second. It's trying to play on me. As I mentioned, here's all the resources. So again, I tried to include links where I could. You also are able to look through there in case any of the specific articles or research is helpful. And finally, here's my email. I went ahead and included, so feel free to reach out to me. It's just julia@urbanwellnesscounseling.com. And I included all the different gorgeous flags here. I know we talked about some of the history of the Pride flag, but there also are some really gorgeous flags if you're attending any Pride events on campus or in your community, or happen to see these on social media. Hopefully this is a helpful reference guide to. I know sometimes when my students come in with a backpack or a sticker on a water bottle, it can be cool to know, hey, I love your non-binary sticker. And that can feel really meaningful, that we're not always having to ask, like, wait, what is that again? So, okay, so I'll open it up for questions. Again, feel free to go off mute. I know some folks may have to slip out because this is our lunch hour, so feel free to pop off if you need to, but I'll stick around till 12:30, and so feel free to use the space. Oh, thanks so much, Meg. I appreciated you being here. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, you all were awesome today. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, good. I'm glad the language was helpful. Awesome. Thank you. You all are so nice. Wow. Students must love all of this warm fuzzy. I feel like my heart is full working with so many awesome educators. I'll cancel my afternoon and we can keep making each other feel warm fuzzy. Okay, well, I'm glad it doesn't look like there are too many questions, which hopefully means we covered what we were needing to cover. Thank you. I'm glad there were some good takeaways in there. As people are thinking of, give a couple more minutes to think of questions. I also want to plug to, and let me see, I don't think I included an urban wellness slide here, but if you have a student that is needing support, as long as they live in Illinois, it is the same email as my email, you all. It's just intake, INTAKE, at urbanwellnesscounseling.com. We have an awesome intake team that is super responsive and helpful. And so if you maybe had somebody on your mind or your heart today that is needing some extra mental health support, we can see students throughout the state of Illinois. I know it's tricky in summer if you had folks go home for the summer, but feel free to reach out to our intake team, reach out to me. I can help get you connected, or maybe you're wanting some therapy for yourself. We have amazing clinicians who work with folks of all ages and stages. And, like I said, I think anyone who's sort of front facing in education or with students right now, it can be really, really, really valuable and important to have that space to kind of process, to make sure you're able to show up to work in the best way you can, and to make sure you're carving out that time for yourself. My guess is a lot of you are helpers and healers, and so making sure that you also are allowing space for you to get help and to heal if you need it. So a plug for all of us, for those around us, and for ourselves. If we can support you at Urban Wellness in any way, please let us know. We also are providing trainings. So grateful to you all for getting connected with us today. But if you have a thought of a space that we could provide a training or get plugged in and help connect you with either coming to speak in a virtual format like this, or maybe even popping into your school live and in person, please let us know how we can do that. Again, you're welcome to reach out to me. Our clinical director's email is Amy, just AMY, at urbanwellnesscounseling.com. And she also loves getting connected with folks from the community and making sure that we're knowing how we can best support everybody. So feel free to use all of those resources for what you're needing.